the Churchill River. Today we have an important motion before us, and I think the motion contains three words that are particularly important: truth, reconciliation, and healing. These are particularly important terms if you want to understand the very essence of this motion. One of the major problems that many Indigenous communities have experienced is the problem of truth. Still today, unfortunately, there are a number of Catholic entities that refuse to provide access to documents related to what happened in the Indian residential schools. And unfortunately, the request for access to that truth has been barred by the Catholic entities, and that's very harmful. And this is harmful to people who have the Catholic faith, who are Catholic believers, and it's hard to understand because truth is an important value for Catholics, and lies are considered a sin. So to have access to those documents could really help people in various communities, help them to understand what happened and why what happened. And horrible things happened in the residential schools. There are people, mothers and fathers, who don't know where their children are buried. And just having access to those documents could help them learn the truth and find out at least some missing parts of their family history. As I said, in the residential schools, it's unspeakable what went on, and the effects are still being felt. And unfortunately, you can still see the effects on young people in communities. Parents lost their children. So there's a lot of difficulty in Indigenous communities. The family relationships were broken. There was a loss of knowledge about how families should operate. Generations have been affected. They don't really know what went on. They might not even be aware of this part of their history, the residential schools, and all those tragic events. What happened was terrible. It's hard to move on if there's been no apology. There was an apology from the Conservative government under Prime Minister Harper, that apology was delivered here in the House of Commons, and Mr. Layton met with chiefs to discuss how important those apologies were to residential school survivors. And now, for many elders in Indigenous communities, elders who were raised under the Catholic faith, for many of those elders, religion is still very important to them. It's fundamental. And I attended a funeral and saw that many Indigenous elders were participating in the funeral. So it's clear that faith is particularly important, and perhaps more so for elders. So it's an important thing. It's an important reality. And receiving an apology from the Pope on behalf of the Catholic community would be extremely meaningful to those elders. That would be a meaningful step along the path toward healing and reconciliation. Reconciliation is a way to accept that, unfortunately, what happened in the past is still a part of our lives, but we can move on. We can turn the page. It's a very difficult step. It takes a lot of work. But when there's an acknowledgement of what happened, when an apology is given, that really allows people to move on toward healing. And healing in the Algonquin community in my riding is a very important step. And if you feel that you've been understood, that there's an acknowledgement or a recognition from the Pope, that could have a very meaningful impact on elders in my community. So I call on all members to take the time to put yourselves in the shoes of Indian residential school survivors. Try to understand what it must be like. And there are, unfortunately, members here in the House who've been impacted by the residential schools, and they can talk to what their experience was. But I think it's important for everyone to understand why it's so important for the Pope to apologize. I'm Catholic, I was baptized, and I can tell you that since Pope Francis has been Pope, I didn't expect things to come as far as they have in terms of homosexuals and other things. So I really hope that Pope Francis will understand what he's being asked to do and will come forward and do it. It took great courage to come forward and apologize in other circumstances. So I think if we can explain clearly to the Pope why this is so important to Indigenous people in our constituencies, why an apology would be such an important step towards truth and reconciliation, I truly hope that the Pope will come forward and apologize. It's not always easy to get an apology, but I can see that unity in this situation would send a clear message to the Pope. And I hope we all understand the importance of that. I hope we can all see how important it is to the survivors, how important it is for them to enable them to turn the page, to get closure and to move on. Often we talk about psychological and physical healing, but spiritual healing is also extremely important. And I think spiritual healing for all those who have remained Catholic requires a papal apology, and that would greatly help. It would be a catalyst. There are elders who have been requesting an apology. They're getting to be quite elderly. They may have illnesses. And I think sincerely that an apology, perhaps before they move on to the afterlife, I think they could move on with a more peaceful heart. And I think for Canada in general, it would be important for the Pope to acknowledge what happened and the significance, the impact on Indigenous people. I think this would be a step towards truth and reconciliation, and I sincerely hope that everyone is willing to move in that direction, to stand up clearly and say, we need this apology from the Pope, and we truly hope that he will hear our message, he will hear the message from Aboriginal people and understand what's behind it.